executed only on the system that called it. So this is a very easy way to do dynamic kind of configurations, because obviously if you do an inventory, especially if you're static inventory, right, you don't know what the host is going to be called. It doesn't exist. It's booting up and then it gets a name somewhere in the process. And so that's a really slick way to do that. And then of course, what we want to talk about today is security automation. So anybody using Ansible for this? Okay, 2 people. Wow, okay. That's great. So you guys should come up here maybe, or please give the ideas that you have. It's an open discussion, so if you guys have any thoughts or want to say something, please do. Okay, so this is at least kind of our understanding or talking to customers of what information security is about. So there's obviously multiple layers here. There's application security, which is about how our applications are talking to one another, services, all of these kind of things that are integrated with one another. Then there's network security, which is kind of the endpoints going from point A to point B. So we're talking about network devices and firewalls and that kind of thing. Then there's forensics, which is really looking into how secure our environments are, or analyzing and digging in and really understanding if we're meeting the requirements, or even what the requirements that we need to meet are. Then there's incident response. So if, for example, a security event occurs, then you have to resolve it, or you have to do something. So that's sort of an incident or response to an incident. Then there's penetration testing, Nessos, or other tools like that are in there in the field that people are using to understand if they have vulnerabilities. And then, of course, there's other areas like around fraud detection, governance, risk, compliance. These are all factors. So it's a really huge area, I would say. So we'll look at maybe not all of these, but a lot of these, and give some examples of where you can use Ansible. Okay, so obviously security is hard, right? Yeah, you need the right technology, but you really need a culture in your organizations and with your people that actually take security first, right? And that actually, when they go about their day and doing things, security is something they're thinking about and conscious about. And of course, if you make it hard to do security, that ain't gonna happen, right? So that's kind of also why we're thinking about this, and so I'll share some ideas about that. Then you also should understand the economics. What's at risk if your company is compromised, or if some security breach occurs? What is the risk of that, and understanding what that means for where you're working. And of course, then there's the processes, how we go about making sure things are secure, making sure that that we're implementing security practices. So going back to Ansible, this is kind of Ansible, right? The more I talk to people doing Ansible, and the more use cases I get out of Ansible, it more becomes this picture. I don't know if that defeats the purpose, maybe, because a Swiss Army knife that big might not fit in your pocket. Depends how big your pants are, I guess. Maybe you need a backpack for it. Ansible's not a unicorn, right? So we're not talking about here Ansible solving all the problems for everything. We're just talking about integrating tools that exist and taking basically processes that are maybe manual, rigid, not flexible, that we don't like, and automating them. And automation is fun, right? So people that participate in the automation and doing things are enjoying more, and it's also creating a collaborative atmosphere. So we're bringing the mentality that software development has to the entire organization. And that's basically what's behind infrastructure as code, or at least the idea there. It's taking a software development approach to doing infrastructure, and Ansible is the language, or a really good language for doing that. So, but it's not a unicorn. And so why do we think Ansible is good for security automation? So first thing is agentless. So if I have to install an agent on all my hosts, right, then I'm increasing my security vector, right? Because that agent's running, it's running on ports, it could be compromised, and et cetera, et cetera. So Ansible is just using SSH, so everybody's pretty much using SSH. If you're not using SSH, then I guess you could argue, well, you have to add SSH. But if you're not, if you don't have SSH, you're probably a mainframe or something. I'm not sure. And on the Windows side, of course, SSH is kind of, I don't know what to say there, but they have PowerShell, and Ansible now with, I think, the 2.4, 2.2, the Windows modules now use WinRM, so you don't need to run SSH in Windows anymore for actually quite a while. So Ansible basically makes remote API calls to PowerShell to drive everything, which is awesome because, yeah, you don't need to actually change anything on the host. So the other piece I think that's good is the desired state. So that's really what security is about, right? You define what you're supposed to achieve, and that becomes your desired state. And then Ansible, if you do your playbooks and things correctly, then Ansible allows you to govern that. And then the other piece that I think is really important here is extensible and modular. So when we talk about security, we're talking about everything. We're talking about everything that's running. And so you need something that's going to be able to communicate to all these different devices and systems. You need something that's extensible because ultimately in your organizations, you're going to have stuff that's unique there where you need to maybe build your own modules or build your own roles or do things in your own way. So all of that, to me at least, is good reason at least to look at Ansible to solve some of this. So again, here I already said, we're not replacing tools that you have. So, you already have maybe some of the automation or configuration management tools like Puppet or Chef. You already have Nessus or FireEye. You have different security tooling. And we're talking about automating that in a way that allows us to make the process for doing security and dealing with security much easier. And so let's look at that a little bit more detail. So basically this is what we kind of have. I know these are really high level and not technical, but examples. But basically developers and operators, DevOps. So developers are writing playbooks that orchestrate their application or their pipelines. Operators are writing playbooks that build the infrastructure stacks, that potentially test the application or roll out application components, and then they put all that together. So imagine right now you have a DevOps team, and the thing about DevOps is obviously speed and doing not 1 or 2 releases every year, but maybe 1 or 2 releases every hour or whatever it is. So it's a lot of speed. There's a lot of releases happening in short cycles. And imagine then your security team comes to you and they give you say, okay, well, we just talked to our auditors and we just defined now a new security template and you need to follow it, and here it is. And it's like some 200-page document that you need to read through, and it doesn't really tell you how to do anything, and you need to do everything. So obviously that's like throwing a boat anchor off your speedboat, right? It's not really working in the model. So you have to stop everything you're doing and read this thing and then implement it. And then guess what? Then they publish version 1.1 at some point later, and then you have to do it all over again. And so you're stopped and you're blocked basically, right? So the idea here is how do we get the security team to actually be part of this whole DevOps process, and maybe instead of providing a document that does everything, they can provide some playbooks. They too can write playbooks that are doing certain things or that are orchestrating stuff. Because again, Ansible is easy, right? Your managers, or if you are a manager, or you can write a playbook. Anyone can write a playbook. It's very basic to get started. And so there's no excuse, there's no steep learning curve here. So that's at least an idea that we can look at, and that's kind of the thought here to look at some of this stuff. So let's get into maybe some of the examples. So has anybody heard of Stig or Security Technical Implementation Guides? Yeah? Okay, a couple people. It's, I guess, more popular in the US. Basically what it attempts to do is it defines a security problem or a risk, and it also provides how to deal with it. So it provides you, if it's whatever, not allowing passwordless SSH, so you don't want to allow anyone to log in with a password, right? Then there's a configuration in your SSHD that you would set. So they would define that, define why it's applicable, and then at the bottom tell you exactly how to change it. So that's kind of good. It's easy to implement, right? Because it tells you exactly what to do, and you just need to automate what they're telling you if you want to follow that. And the really cool thing here is, and I'll talk about this later, there's actually a community in Ansible that are building roles around these Stig guidelines. So there's already ready to consume tons of roles, and you can participate. I'll get to that later. The next thing is PCI, who has to deal with, or who works in organizations like banks or anything has to do with PCI. So PCI is a real challenge, right? Because it's a, let's say it's a, there's no black and white in PCI. It's all gray, right? It's this guideline for what you need to do, and you need to then hire some external auditor to check to see if you're actually compliant, and what they mean by what they're saying, and interpretation and all this other stuff. So it's very challenging to go through, okay, here's if we want to be PCI compliant to whatever version 3 or 3.2, I think, which is the current one. Then you have to go through, you have to read all this stuff, and it goes into all kinds of aspects, and you have to analyze all this stuff, and you yourself have to figure out, well, how do we do that in our organization, right? So it's quite a challenge. So we'll show at least some idea there. Remediation. So all the time we see security vulnerabilities happen, and Red Hat's pretty quick at fixing these things. A lot of them within 24 hours. And I think all major ones, but you might be in a business where that isn't good enough. Like, you just found out about it and there's still not a fix an hour later, but you know what you need to do in order to circumvent the problem because it's known. So you could write a playbook, for example, to do that. So that's an idea. And then there's standards, of course, at your companies that security team and others are involved with creating. So again, automating those so you don't have to manually go with those or deal with those. And then incident response. In the case of something, event happening, how do you remediate it? So let's look at some of these. So the first one, we'll look at a couple rules. This is a Stig rule for an SSH daemon not allowing empty passwords, right? So it's pretty easy. It's just SSHD config and permit empty passwords to no. So if we dissect that a little bit, that's why Stig is really nice. We can say, okay, line, it needs us to edit a line. So we're talking about line in file, which is the Ansible module to edit that, and then obviously we want to change something. So pretty basic. I think one of the cool things here, do you guys know about validate, the validate function in the line and file module? Yeah, some people. So that's really good because basically what validate does, so we're changing the file. Validate allows us to actually run something that checks if the syntax of the file is okay still. So we're running basically SSHD, and the idea is, okay, if SSHD throws, if the syntax of the file is mangled, then it's gonna bomb out and get an error, in which case we would know about it here. So we talked about testing. This isn't a replacement for writing tests, but this is just an example of something in the line and file module that's useful for that. So I thought that was kind of a good use case, at least for that. Yep, question?
Would it be possible to make a rollback if, for example, this command fails?
A rollback? Yeah, I mean, so in Ansible there's different triggers you can set and different things you can do. So like based on something successful or something failed, you can then have something else clean up after it. Yeah, that's possible. You have to write that though into your playbook. So there's a couple different ways of doing that or dealing with that, basically doing error handling in Ansible. So again, there's different ways, but that's something that your role or your playbook would need to take care of. So, okay. So that's one very basic example. Here's another one, another basic one, Sis Etl. So basically coming in and saying, okay, not allowing unauthorized code to execute in memory, or taking advantage of at least that. So here again, we can look and analyze this and see Sis Etl, the kernel randomize, and again, there's a module for Sis Etl. So we could use also line and file and then rerun Sis Etl if we wanted to, but there's a module for this. And then you see the notify. Notify is, again, for those of you who are new, this is a way to then execute. So based on if it needed to actually do this and did it, then it would reboot the system in this case. So that's a way you can also have certain triggers built into your tasks. Another one here is configuring networking. So we're talking about here management network and basically ACLs. So making sure that connections from the management hosts on the management network only go through the management network. So in this case, we're actually talking to I think a Cisco device. Yeah, we're talking to iOS. So you see here, this is Cisco, as well as almost all the network companies are now also providing Ansible modules. So we can actually use those to communicate with the device. In this case, set up ACLs properly and implement or activate those ACLs. So that's what this rule is doing here. I mean, these are just some basic ones. And here's one on Windows. I must say, not being much of a Windows guy, this took quite a bit of research to actually figure out. It's not so implicit, but in this case, we wanted to restrict anonymous enumeration of file shares, and that ends up being a registry setting, so you actually have to go figure out where in the registry that needs to change. But thankfully, there's a registry module that's provided in Ansible, so again, you can easily, once you know what you need to do, edit a registry in a Windows system without installing any software in Windows or anything at all. So that's really good. I think you guys get the idea of these Stig. Obviously, I would check out the roles that are being provided. They're much more in detail than just this. These are just some basic examples of some things. But that kind of gets you the idea of how you can think about this. You can read these Stig guidelines, and they're all written the same way. These are examples of them, and how you can interpolate those into Ansible, basically. So it's very, very straightforward. Okay, something that's not straightforward is PCI. So I think one of the things that's in every PCI is your systems need to be updated within a month. So whatever software you have, it needs to always be updated. So that's a pretty easy one to deal with, at least in Ansible. We have to install security patches. So in this case, we have 2 operating systems, one RHEL and one Debian. And in this case, we are using Yum, of course, which is what Red Hat Enterprise Linux uses to install RPMs. And for Debian, we're using apt-get. So there's a basically a module for that as well. And the one thing on Debian, which I think is interesting, there's a cache validate time there. So you can actually set that here in this case to 7200, which is 1 month. So you're actually there implicitly saying that the packages are only going to be 1 month. On the RHEL side, you would have to execute that then once a month, or typically people that do updates, they have some other software outside that's executing or deciding when to run, when to do updates. This is a good use case, by the way, for Ansible Tower or AWX, which has a scheduler built into it, so you could actually create a job schedule that would then keep your systems up to date across everything. Okay, then we can go on. So remediation, how many of you had to deal with shell shock a couple years ago? Okay, a couple of you. So yeah, shell shock was kind of a bad one, right? So it was a vulnerability in Bash where you could pass basically environment parameters and have it execute malicious code. So in this case, obviously everybody's quick to fix it. Here we have actually written some tests to test the vulnerability. So there's basically two things to check at least. So at first, when people identify the vulnerability, it goes public. They also typically write, okay, what the vulnerability was, what they did to expose it. So you could quickly put together, as an example, you could quickly put together a playbook that updates Bash, so tries to update the latest, and then runs the tests. And then you would know, okay, if your systems are affected or not. So maybe there's not an update yet, or maybe you didn't have You didn't update the RPM, because a lot of people pull their RPMs or their content from an internal system, right? So that needs to be updated before everyone else can get access to it, that kind of thing. This, though, would give you the ability to know and run this thing. You could run it every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, and it constantly give you an idea across all your systems to make sure you know that when they're all fixed, and that you're constantly looking for that update. So that's just an example, basic example of quickly throwing together something. This probably could take, I don't know, 20 minutes or something to put together and test, 30 minutes, and then problem solved. You have at least a remediation for this really quickly. So that's another good example to think about. Then another one here is Red Hat often releases CVEs, right? So again, you may, in this case, you don't have maybe the fix isn't there yet, or you don't have access to it for whatever reason. But here in this case, it was a TCP challenge ACK limit there was a vulnerability. So you could set that incredibly high to basically make the probability of the vulnerability basically 0. So that was an example here again of something you could just quickly put together, or some ideas and thoughts. Because the CVs obviously also explain where their vulnerability is, how you can test for it, and what you can do in the meantime until a patch is released. Okay, then we get into kind of internal standards talked about. So I think, yeah, so changing the password, root password every 60 days. Does anyone do that here? One person? Okay. I won't pick on you, but yeah, it's probably not the best way to do things. Probably you would want to have user accounts that have names associated to them, and then use sudo and force the users to change their names, but not actually change the root password. But regardless, the example here is just a basic example to illustrate. Your company has policies. They have certain things they want to do. And you don't want to be, applying this stuff manually and mucking around. You want to be, automating it, being done with it, and then for sure that the systems will reflect that. So in this case, it's just an example. You can also see here the passwords are actually coming from Vault. So there's a Vault file where actually this is the passwords are stored and whatnot, and yeah, how they're being changed. So it's a very basic. Again, these are all basic examples, but just give you some ideas. Incident response. So this is kind of around logging. Yeah, typically people have centralized logging. In this case, you might not have centralized logging, or maybe all your logs are not there. So if you're dealing with an incident, the first thing you need to do is get information. So a security breach happened, the security team saying, hey, look into this. We've got some peculiar activity. Look for these error message, look for these patterns in your system logs or in your application logs or whatever it is. And so the first thing you want to do is gather all the logs so you can actually do that. So in this case, one of the nice things, the find logs and the fetch logs, in Ansible, actually the module will create a hierarchy. So it's basically host by host. So each host you'll have directory structure with host and then all the logs in them. So it's very easy from there to actually go through things. Even if you had, a central logging system where everything was, you could still use Ansible, obviously, to go through there and search for things, get information, and do some analytics or some forensics on that. So that's another idea, at least, where we can use Ansible to make things easier. Okay, so to get involved with the security community, like I said, this is a pretty new area that is being tackled, and is Ansible Lockdown. So if you go on GitHub, look for the Ansible Lockdown community. That's, like I said, they're building roles around Stig and these security implementation guidelines. So go on there, look at that stuff. Then there's a community around Ansible Hardening. This was actually started by Rackspace, so it's very much focused around what Rackspace is doing, but nevertheless, I think there's probably a lot to learn from what they're doing. So you're not going to be able to probably take one-to-one what they have and implement it, but you can take certain things, certainly contribute and work with those guys. So that's another community. There's a mailing list also for Ansible Lockdown. So if you're interested in that, again, get on GitHub, get on the mailing list. And then, of course, there's in Galaxy, there's a bunch of roles that people are building, starting to build with security. So there's a tag for that, security. If you look for roles that are doing that, you'll probably find interesting stuff there that you can reuse. And here's a link to some demo playbooks on that one. So that's basically all I had on this topic. Are there any questions, discussion points? Anything you said? No? Okay.
So there would be from my side some sort of question, but more of a recommendation. How do we, like, patching? How do we address patching? Because security is also about, like you said, every month patch, and you had the young and you had the app, but the ecosystem around patching, is it also something that you can manage with Ansible? Is it something that can be automated in a way? Or?
Yeah, I mean, you mean the ecosystem around patching, you mean like getting all the repositories and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah, or subscribing to the repository.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there's a lot of different approaches here, right? So each type of, each company or each, vendor that's providing, software and packaging provides sort of their own packaging formats, in Debian and Ubuntu and, SUSE and Red Hat, and they're all using different packaging formats. There is, of course, software around that is provided. Ansible is simply orchestrating the actual updates in this case. So I don't think, I mean, I have talked to organizations that are basically doing this, have their own solutions where they're basically pulling the content down. So you could use Ansible certainly to like orchestrate pulling that down, putting it into repositories, automating. You could certainly automate that whole process. Most though usually go to tools like Foreman or Satellite, the product from Red Hat, and things because what is also needed around patching and around software is lifecycle management. So you may have different environments like development, test, production, and each different environment is going to need different versions of the software. And so while you could theoretically, of course, with Ansible or on your own, write some stuff that creates these views, let's say, to all these things, it becomes very complex and very challenging very fast. And then if you also have, like a lot of organizations, not only the environments, but then each application in the environment needs a different version of this and a different version of that, it becomes really difficult. So that's where that kind of lifecycle management, systems management software is there. And I think, Foreman, if you want to try to find a solution for everything, I think Foreman and Catello and those projects are a good place to start. If you're a Red Hat only customer, then you're probably going to want Satellite or what we provide on that area, because there's also obviously things with how we're doing stuff. But that's how I would look at it, at least. I don't think you want to solve that necessarily, like lifecycle management with Ansible, or you want to use probably a tool. How are you guys doing this? You have all these different operating systems, and what are you using actually?
So we went to the idea that we have to write our own generic patching framework.
Okay, so you build your own.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you look at Foreman and Catello?
We looked at all those tools that like Cobbler, Foreman, Catello, all these tools that help you deploy. But at the end, we saw them moving very fast, and then you have to keep up with them too.
Yeah.
You can't stay on a version, and we needed a little bit of stability, so that's why we wrote the tools that we keep as a piece.
Okay.
The question that I would add here is, because this way we have, as you mentioned, we can use those tools and but also you can write your thing. But we are a little bit now in the need to patch the network appliances and other things that this we don't have a good solution for now. To patch the switches, for example, without breaking them.
Yep.
Patch some other things that they are not load balanced, so they are not redundant and so on. So this is also a topic that maybe, I don't know, network modules will help with patching in the future with Ansible, because there is no real patching for network stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, on the Ansible side, it's really about the orchestration, right? I mean, it's about, okay, you have the patches, so now you want to deploy them, you want to do it in a certain way. As far as getting the patches and making them available so that they could be in the system, that's something, again, like we talked about, you could solve that with Ansible, but probably you're using some other tooling there. As far as, you made up a point, the network modules, so I mean, basically, you know, the networking companies have been providing modules to the Ansible community, and so what Red Hat's done basically is we provide now support for those network modules as an option if people want support for those modules. And so there's a list of modules that are part of that, right? But there's, I think, let's say, it's rapidly growing on the networking side. I've talked to quite a lot of customers lately. To be honest, most of the network teams are kind of behind as far as this topic goes, automation, infrastructure as code. But there's eagerness to do this because they see and also recognize that doesn't scale, and it's also not very reliable way of working, right? Not having everything automated. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty excited about that. I think there's a lot to come there on that side.
I think software-defined networks is the next thing for automation.
Yeah, and especially that's a good point. I mean, so if you just have a flat network, right, with typical traditional networking, that's one thing. But as soon as you start, you know, getting into containers, you need an overlay network to connect container hosts, right? Now you've got an SDN, and now you've got very many layers, and now, you know, try to, you know, deal with the problem, right? The level of complexity is going up. That's why automation is so important, because as, you know, the new technology, the new things we have aren't creating less complexity, they're creating more complexity. That's why we need to, we're getting a lot in return with speed and the way we work and flexibility, but the level of complexity is going up, and at a certain point, you know, you have kind of your uptime of your applications and everything. If you get to the level of complexity, you can no longer potentially achieve that anymore just due to the level of complexity without automation, and that's why automation is no longer, you know, this is not a nice thing to have, but it's a must thing. If you don't do it, you're dead, basically. Yep, in the back.
Can you say something about the integration of Foreman or Catalog with Ansible? Because I think both should be Red Hat right now, and so therefore we're pretty interested in. We're automating with Puppet. Our infrastructure is basically automated with Foreman and Puppet, and we're thinking about also going back to Ansible, which we really left last year.
Okay.
Just in order to use Puppet, because our colleagues were more
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that. I mean, so, you know, there's a difference. Let's say, first of all, to address your point, I think on, you know, Foreman is part of Satellite, which is a product Red Hat provides, and Ansible obviously is also a product. And so I caution on making a correlation to upstream communities and what Red Hat does. We do all our software development upstream, but there's a big difference between the upstream community and then what's provided downstream, right? So we're constantly working on that, but we go through a very rigorous process of where we evaluate the capabilities, where we deem them, you know, ready for enterprise consumption. And also then think about, especially in the context of Foreman, you've got Foreman's just provisioning, right? You've also got Catalog, which is you need to store your content that you know you're using. You've got configuration management in there. There's also, you know, subscription management, pieces from Candlepin. So all of these projects are coming together in a product. And so there's some ideas and concepts behind that. So what Red Hat did was with our provisioning product, which is based off Foreman. We looked at the time we didn't have Ansible, so we integrated with Puppet. So Puppet basically became part of the integration. To be honest, I never really liked, me personally, what the integrate. I mean, I like the integration, but I think on the configuration management, the idea of coupling, tightly coupling, let's say software RPM with configuration management is not a good idea, because the life cycle is completely different, or the change rate is different. So when you do RPMs, you're probably updating once a month or once a week. When you do configuration management, especially once you really start automating everything, you're doing changes, every hour. And so these two, different wheels, if you will, don't really roll together at the same thing. So I think we had an idea, and as we talked to more companies and saw what we originally did, there, customers deployed it a different way with a little bit more of a looser coupling there. So what we're doing is we're integrating. So there's currently, obviously for Puppet as well as for Ansible, there's Foreman plugins which we use. We're integrating right now Ansible into that. And we also, you can use Foreman basically to call out. So you'll be able to, inside Foreman or inside, you can already do this in Foreman, but inside our product, you'll be able to run basically playbooks, have playbooks stored with your RPM content. But again, it's just like what we did with Puppet. It's a rather tight coupling. I think a better idea is to split out the configuration management, do the testing of all of that outside, and then integrate at the time where you actually deploy the systems. So when you deploy the systems, then you're using satellite to deploy the Puppet infrastructure, the Ansible infrastructure that you need in that case, maybe handling the keys that you have, because you probably just are using a Foreman user or something like that. So, but I think a looser coupling is good. I would look at like Tower or AWX if you're doing the community, because I think you're really going to want to take advantage of having Ansible as part of your systems and your operating system provisioning, but also use it for other things. And have all the same teams using the same platform for doing that. So, DevOps teams who have nothing to do with provisioning of systems are also using the same, they're using different playbooks and different stuff, but they're using the same tooling. So I think that might be a more interesting way to go.
Yeah, because you said that you're against tying things too close together, fixing everything in the to Foreman if it comes to package management and such. And at the other hand, for me, it's tying again. If you're just saying use AWX or use Ansible Tower, because then you're again locked in. At this time, it's Ansible.
Well, I mean, at some level, you have to decide, right? I mean, what we're talking about here is a standardization for automation language. So having one language that everybody is using is of a tremendous benefit. You don't want in your organization to have everybody using a different tooling, because if that happens, then there's no synergy, there's no reusability, everybody's reinventing the wheel for themselves. And so the value is tremendous around, in this case, around automation. Automation is everywhere, therefore there should be one automation infrastructure and language. So you need to decide for you, I think, what the best one is, if it's Ansible, Puppet, Chef, CF Engine, whatever. All I'm saying is...
Why don't you go cherry picking and choose the best recipe or the best knife or how you name it?
Mm-hmm.
That was the idea.
Well, because then you just get a zoo of tools that don't interact with each other, right? Remember what I said about complexity? Yeah, I mean, that's what people did for a long time, like in storage and all the other things. Is like, okay, I need a really fast storage box, so I'm going to buy this one because it can do this specific thing better than anyone else. Oh, I need a file storage. Now I'm going to buy this specific one because it can do that better than anyone else. And then all of a sudden, you realize things need to scale, right? And guess what? That doesn't scale. And so then it comes down to, okay, well, do I really need the best? I mean, maybe 80% is good enough, or maybe something's good enough, and then I can use something across the same token. So it depends. If you're talking about infrastructure, I think cherry picking isn't a good idea, because standardization is going to be what you want to do. If you're talking about software development, absolutely. if you're looking at microservices and things like that, that's the idea behind those. Polyglot, that you choose your programming language, the best one for that service or for that operation. But then again, there's only one team that's managing that. It's not, services aren't shared across things, so it's a different thing. If your infrastructure teams are also set up the same way, where everybody's building their own data center, then great, pick your own is the way to go. But that's not, from an infrastructure perspective. Typically, we're talking about sharing and reusability, and so I mean, these are just my views, right? This isn't anything read at. I'm here for myself, but that's how I look at it. But it's good discussion. Yeah.
Just practical questions. If you have a security sensitive area and you have that server and you want to manage your servers with Ansible, and within the servers there are virtualizations, containers, whatever, which you also manage. And probably in security, really security sensitive areas, you want to put all the user images into separate VLANs. So then the question is, how do you reach them? Do you have a management station where Ansible runs, which participates in all of the VLANs, which potentially, probably I'm overly paranoid here, but potentially is not a good idea in high security areas? Or do you switch over to VLANs, or what?
Well, I mean, I think that depends on your network design, right? So if your network design, isolates things or wants to isolate things, then you're going to end up needing to run Ansible in that zone. If you don't want to allow traffic in or out. And so, I mean, your networking team, security team are the people that are going to dictate that. You can certainly influence it. I mean, there's overlay technologies with SDNs where you can kind of get away from building VLANs and do things a little bit differently that could help. But again, that's a networking discussion. I think Ansible, you have the situation that you have, and you'd like to automate, so you want to do something. I think one thing that would be good to look at, and here's again where I see Tower has an interesting use cases. There's basically Tower instances. So these are instances of basically Ansible Tower has various instances. It's kind of an active HA configuration, if you will, and that's basically the scheduler. And so you can basically create groups of these instances. And you could create different groups in different areas of your organization. And then there's also a disconnected instance. So it's possible to have an instance that's disconnected. It's basically acting like a proxy in a way that basically is just proxying Ansible on through to hosts that it can reach. So the end host, it's basically acting in that way. So it's a one-way proxy. So that's kind of would be something that in a very secure, like we deal with a lot of banks or government agencies, and this is something that they pushed Red Hat to do, which is why we did it. And that's a feature that capability that's there, but you really need something on top of Ansible. Ansible by itself, guys, as any of you who've worked with it, it's just basically a runtime around the playbook language, which is YAML. That's it, right? So, to really run this at an enterprise level with lots of different teams doing lots of different things, you need role-based access, you need secrets management, you need, to understand your organizational elements, understand the network boundaries, have kind of an HA, obviously, or scale out type of solution. And that's where really that comes in, and that's why our customers, who need that look there. So. If you guys want to check it out, I encourage you, AWX community, check it out, and anyone can get hold of it and play around with it.
I can add a little bit to the response. So if you have different hypervisors, for example, we use the APIs of the VMware to send shell commands to the operating system. So basically, you create an out-of-band interface.
So you're not going via SSH,
no.
But through the hosting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So then you can lock down your system that it doesn't allow any outside connection, and then via the VMware API or whatever API you would use there, you can effectively send shell commands authenticating yourself as the user or as the root, and you can do things in there, and you get the response.
But that sounds like what a disconnected instance would do as well, as far as in tower. Sounds the same.
This is a similar concept. It's
Yeah.
just done with the Ansible core.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're talking about You're talking about a solution if you don't have a tower or AWX with Ansible core, that you could use the hypervisor layer, in this case VMware, that it could basically proxy through those commands. Okay. Gotcha. Cool. Yeah.
Essentially, this means
Yeah.
you only need access to the host or the hypervisor, but not an SSH access to the virtualizations, because you bypass.
You have to have VM tools installed, for example, but yeah, you can use it like that. It will be a lot of testing for the role, I promise you.
And you're not going to be able to use the normal Ansible modules for it then?
No, it is Ansible module. It's a VMware shell module, which is provided.
So for example, if you wanted to use the APT module for doing an update or something like that?
No, you have to use shell.
You'd have to use an APT and then the command, basically. So it's basically equivalent.
You're not going to use the modules
Exactly.
for
You can
commands you want.
An embedded Ansible module inside.
It's basically like just using Ansible shell or command, basically those two modules, which and not anything else. But the issue there is item potency, right? So then you lose item potency. And then, because for those of you that don't know, so like one of the things that's really important in Ansible, like we're just getting, is like item potency, right? So if you just run a command, I mean, I know most of you in this room know this, but since a couple people are new to Ansible, I think it's worth saying. So if you run a command, you just run a command multiple times, what's going to happen? The first time it does something, it's going to work, and then the second time it's going to throw an error and that kind of thing. So what you want to happen is basically when you run something, for it to be aware of, it's already done, it doesn't need to do it. So you can run it hundreds of times, thousands of times, and if it needs to change something, it's changed. If it doesn't need to change something, it doesn't need to change it. So this concept of item potency, this is baked in, not to all modules, but to many, most of all the core modules and things, but it's something that's very important when you're, looking and researching modules. If you need this behavior, that you make sure that the modules has that behavior.
Molecule has idempotency check.
Oh, that's even an awesome thing right there. That's awesome, because that's something I actually run into a lot of times. Is I use something, and then later on I've got it all working, and I've only ran it though once or something, and I've already done some work, and I'm like, oh man, this isn't going to work, and then I start back over. So that's really actually a really good use case for Molecule right there, is to actually figure out if that's the case or not. So, yeah, basically invalidating modules that are not idempotent, not allowing you to use them. It's a good thing. Anything else? Yep.
We are talking about how to integrate Ansible with IPS or ATS or log correlation tools and some other.
With log correlation, so you mentioned a couple acronyms that I didn't. Are those log correlation systems?
And on top of this, we can have log correlation that comes alerts from Snort and other tools like from DNS, from anything else, and creates the security incidences. And how can we integrate Ansible with this?
So I mean, I think typically, just you tell me if I understood it or not. So you're basically generating, events, right? And then events gets generated, and then in order to resolve the event, you need to do something on your system, right? That's what you're basically talking about. So in this context, how would we use Ansible, or what are some ideas to use Ansible? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, as you mentioned, there's a couple things, right? One of them is to resolve it. Another side is you might need to actually make this aware to other tools and pieces of software. So, I mean, I've worked with, at least had one customer where they're using something like Resolve. It's built around, I don't know if you guys have heard about it. I didn't recognize the software you mentioned, but there's basically software that's incident management, right? And it gets into really workflows and defining a workflow of what should occur when an incident happens. So going to the thinking around incident management comes from ITIL. So there's two types of changes. There's basically normal standard changes and non-standard changes. And so if we understand, events that happen and we understand what we're supposed to do when they happen, then we can create a change for that standard. So that piece can be automated in Ansible, right? There's also one thing that could be interesting to look at, like there might be workflows that you have in these kind of tooling which is geared towards this kind of thing, so Ansible may not be able to replace that, but in at least Tower there's the workflows. So you have in Tower a job template which executes one playbook, but then you have a workflow template, and a workflow template allows you to execute a bunch of playbooks. And so you can do logic like, it executes your first playbook. If that succeeds, then it executes another one. If it doesn't succeed, then it does something. You can also do in parallel things. So you have quite a bit of flexibility there to create a workflow around that. So I think basically, to answer your question short, I mean, Ansible would be basically the glue. I would try to, if you're using Ansible, you want everything that's touching the systems to be in the same language. Ansible, you don't want to do like one-off stuff. So at least at a minimum, like the actual things that need to be resolved or what should occur based on an event should be written in Ansible. How you trigger it though could be then, you could use software that you have that does that has some incident. You could use Tower, you could use whatever. I mean, that would be at least how I would approach it. So I would try to, build that, at least the automation for making changes in Ansible. Yeah. And that's what we did actually, this customer. They had, Resolve also had its own language and stuff, but again, only 4 or 5 people at the company could do this and understood it, and so there's no reusability, and that's where the value was for them to do Ansible, because they could reuse actually stuff. So somebody working in, Linux team can say, hey, when we get this error, this is what you should do, here's the playbook, just run this playbook, and they can just take it, import it, and run it off their system, and they don't have to reinvent how to do that. And so there's more leveraging across the teams.
I've got another question.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to roll back something you already rolled out of the servers, there's always for those modules some state like absent, whatever. But I think it's kind of hard to maintain this if you run Ansible for many, many years. The list of absent applications or probably users who don't have access anymore gets longer and longer. Do you have some best practices how to work with it? Is it better to just drop the machine, create a new one, install everything fresh from the beginning, or what would be the best practice you would recommend? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's always good to build, to destroy and build. I mean, that's typically what you want to strive for. I think there's reasons for that, because obviously, as you maintain and run a system, even if you're using Ansible and all these things, they're running systems that things can get, in, let's say, a non-desired state. And that's why a lot of DevOps, a lot of stuff is built around container, or people are going to containers, because it provides kind of this immutability. Every change is a rebuild of the entire system. So you may not want to be that aggressive about it, but I think in general, that's a good practice. If your application and if your systems can survive in that model. There's obviously a lot of applications that can't be shut off. They have to run and run and run. So then it's not feasible, and they're not active in these kind of things, right? And so yeah, in that case, you're going to have that. You're going to have to deal with that. But I would at least say that the best practice, if you can, is to do build up, tear down. I mean, maybe Mihai, you have some more, because you're obviously in an environment where that is much more prevalent. What you guys have any best practices for dealing with that?
Yeah, like you said, we are immutable infrastructure on physical, virtual, everything.
Everything you guys do is immutable. You don't have any.
If you want to update Apache?
Yeah.
Reinstall.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I mean, definitely that's the way to go, because then you know it's gonna work. Yeah. And
It
keep
also
them.
keeps your playbooks and roles
It's much smaller.
much
Yeah.
slimmer.
Yep, exactly. You don't have to do as much checking, definitely. But again, I mean, like I said, I know customers' environments where they say this server gets rebooted once a year during this time, and that's it. And you know, I mean, you can try to. You have to. I think that's a philosophical change that needs to happen.
Force reboot of every server at least 1 month.
Yep.
Once per month.
That's kind of the chaos monkey sort of, you know, from what Netflix, how Netflix built their architecture. You guys probably heard of that, where they do, you know, chaos monkeys. Sort of, you do something destructive in the environment, see what happens, right? And obviously, your application, you know, your infrastructure is built to deal with that. But you understand and learn from that. So that's an example. You just reboot systems, and then you make sure that at least you avoid that issue that a system is just running, and then all of a sudden has some artifact that no other system has, and that later results in some kind of erase condition in the environment or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then there is also this idea that you need to provoke errors, because we are not focusing on maintaining systems, but we are focusing on recovering from damage. So it's like, how fast can you recover?
Yep.
It's more valuable than how long can you keep the system running.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, as we all see, the world's getting more complex. Everything's getting more complex. So there's going to be a lot of more problems. So it's exactly more, that's your point, more valuable to be able to deal with those problems, as opposed just to knowing how to run a certain state for X period with 5 nines or 6 nines or whatever it is. So that's kind of the old mentality of these 5 nines, 10 nines, 11 nines, whatever your SLA is, and then you build all this complex infrastructure to support that. And that worked for a while, but unfortunately complexity one time at a certain point takes over, where it's no longer feasible or able to do that. And so that's exactly the thought. If you talk to the Google guys, that's what they're also preaching, and all of people that are running large clouds and large environments. Yeah.
In these cases, you better build up your system to support redundancy in a good way, and then you can update and start a new machine, and then shut down the old, so without interruptions of the service.
So this is like the green-blue deployment.
Yep.
If the problem isn't happening on the load balancer, everything's fine.
Yep.
So I know this algorithm from safety environment, which is much more paranoid than security, and they have typically 3 or more instances of the service running in parallel on different machines.
Yep.
There you need to be able to do things like this.
Yep. But that's how a lot of people are going about change. It's like with blue-green, you have your environment running, it's blue right now, and then that's version 1, and version 1.1 is green, which isn't running live, and you basically test everything, do everything, and then when all the tests are satisfied and everything, then you cut the load balancer over. What Netflix does is more of a canary. They do a canary actually deployment, which is actually they have multiple versions of environments, and they load balance, and they say bring up a new version of their application, and let's say it's 100% on blue, and then they bring in 10% green, which is the new version, and then every 10th user goes to that version, and they analyze analytics, gather feedback on what the user, did they stay longer, did they react better with the system, and if so, then they ramp up automatically until it gets a higher number. If not, then it goes down, and they start from scratch. So there's all kinds of concepts around that kind of thing. But again, the key to do any of this kind of stuff is 100% automation, right? And that's why, again, Ansible, I think, is a very valuable thing for all of us to learn and master, because that's the building block. Anything else? Yep.
One question, because you say that this is when something, when something wrong, so you just want to do everything from scratch. But there's some, for the Apache server, for example, this is easy to reinstall the package, but for example, for the database, because we have a lot of data from the customer, and there's not only the config file and data inside, so how can you reinstall the database?
Well, I think at the end of the day, all of the, let's say, all of the specific stuff, the data is stored somewhere, right? So it's hopefully not on local storage on, the VM or the system, but, on some kind of a storage system that's decoupled from the application. And so if that's the case, then the database is only the configuration for that, and that's known. So you can trash it, rebuild it, connect it to the data, however that's done, and it should be, how you guys have this? Is there anything to take into consideration there? Maybe I'm thinking about it, oversimplifying it, but
so
or anyone else?
We look at every host as a container. So every physical, virtual host, you name it, for us is expandable compute.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have to have the storage somehow managed. So anything can be erased and reinstalled, and then the Ansible playbooks and roles that we have can find and reconnect the storage.
Okay.
So if you have a database, in this case, I will run it into a cluster, but if you don't have it into a cluster, so you have a database that it's like somehow, so then there is a recurrent dumping or something like that, so then you would be able to reconnect it, or even reset it, re-import it, if it's a MySQL-like database. If it's another kind of database, there are rules about that. Normally we look at every piece of compute as expandable, so you can lose it at any time, and the question is how fast and how you get it back.
Yeah.
So we are working towards that.
There's also database. You could also do database replication. Obviously, if you have an active, you're generally looking at a different type of database technology there. Probably NoSQL, Cassandra, Couchbase, that kind of thing. But even, with Oracle or traditional databases, you can still have active concepts. If you have that, then of course you can kill, you can kill a member of there, and it'll survive and rebuild it. But if that's not the case, then you obviously have to. If it's a singleton, you have to reconnect it. However that is. But again, with Ansible, if you automate all this, then it's no problem.
So for these singletons, we also have a different problem. You might get your disk encrypted. So then it's a different topic that you have to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
So if your storage doesn't support snapshotting, backup, or quick set to a date where you can, because let's have a scenario like this: you have your database and you have, your storage encrypted. Your database will still run. It's like in the memory and.
Do you mean corrupted instead of encrypted?
Encrypted. Like
Encrypted.
WannaCry.
Yeah. Okay.
Or
something like that.
Okay.
So then.
Or looks like my laptop drive is looks encrypted, right? So
not purposely encrypted is what he's getting.
Yeah.
Purposely maliciously encrypted.
Yeah.
Okay, maliciously encrypted. Okay, I wasn't following that either.
You never leave one point of failure. You have always to think like, well, you have one, you have no one. When you have two, you have one. You always need to think like a point of failure, because if you have a data center your building can be destroyed by a bomb or fire or something, and then you even need to think there's some data in internet or in the cloud or somewhere, and also think about replication. Replication is not backup. Replication is just like you have high available databases, but you don't have backups. And as he said,
you are always dumping this database, and dumping this database every hour or every half an hour. Is that the thing which you need to plan? You have to have a plan in your company. How much time of this window that the system can fail, and how much time you need to reinstall everything, because you need also to think, could be just a colleague that deleted something from database, or can be really a disaster, and then you need to build everything from new. And that's a kind of plan you have to do in your company, how much time you need to rebuild, how much time you need to restore a backup for 1 hour ago, and that's the thing you have to think. And it's really important to have storage, like the replication from storage also, and also think about encryption. That's one thing. If you have database with sensitive data from customers or from your colleagues there, you have to encrypt also this stuff. There's a lot of things you have to think.
But I think you have to consider the different reasons or different causes of so that's what we discussed at the beginning was the cause that we want to have a scheduled downtime of one container, one database instance, whatever. So that's a normal non-failure case. And in this case, probably you want a synchronization mechanism with a redundant database which goes on second or far below second time scale. But what you mentioned is the additional layer which you need, of course, also which shields against failures or attacks. So I think you need both. And what you mentioned, as I understood, mainly goes into the direction how can I synchronize databases if I update something on one point. You also have to consider this.
You have to consider
you can't use
different versions from database systems, for example, like test one staging and one production. You can do both.
That's probably something the database has to support, because without that you can do this with dumping databases and reread them. So there are different time scales, different redundancy mechanisms.
Okay, good discussion. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
One question, maybe it doesn't fit to the topic security, but I'm looking for a nice and easy procedure to migrate all my Ansible core stuff to Ansible Tower. All the playbooks, taskbooks, variables files, inventory stuff, that's a lot of things.
Yep.
Is there a documentation how to migrate this? I don't want to type again to Ansible Tower.
Yeah, I mean you can. There's a I think Tower Manage. There's a tool to do importing of your basically the playbooks is you don't have to do anything, right? The playbooks are all in Git. So the only thing you have to do is make the playbooks available in Git or SVN to be consumed in Tower. So assuming that's the case, you're done there. So really the area is around your group vars and your inventories. That's the piece that you need to do. So yeah, so basically the group vars, there's a tool, Tower Manage, that you could do that'll import. If you're using, there are some caveats to that depending on how you're structuring things. So it may not work for all of the things, in which case you would have to create those in the inventories themselves. So basically you can either import them and use them if you're using static inventories. Really the way Tower wants to work is with the dynamic inventories, in which case there's already out of the box a bunch of them for various infrastructure platforms. You can also provide your own custom inventory that will populate Tower with all the hosts, and then it's just a question of group vars, host vars, and getting those in from your files that you have right now that are static. So I would look at the Tower Manage. I forget what it's called. Maybe. Well, Tower Manage is the CLI tool basically that allows you to import those things. But it shouldn't be too bad. Hopefully, I mean, I did this with OpenShift, which was kind of complicated because it uses like child groups and things like that, which didn't import with Tower Management, so I had to create them. Even there, it took me, I don't know, an hour or two, you know, to figure it out. So it's not too bad. Yeah, I would just go. You can also ask questions. I think there's quite a lot of lists, and the community around it's pretty responsive too. So people probably give you ideas. It's hard to tell you without like examples or give you some ideas on what specifically. But I look at Tower Manage to import those. I think it's Tower Manage group import, host var import, something like that. Yeah.
I have also another question. Doesn't fit
Mm-hmm.
security.
No, it's okay. We kind of jumped off the security topic quite a long time ago.
So we are in the ideas for the next meetup.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say thank you, Keith, for the good talk, and thank you for the good talk and the long Q&A session.